10:30 p.m. was way later than Cody Jackson had expected to be returning home that night when he stopped. He had been to meet a new client. In fact, his only client for the website design company he had set up a few months previously. 3 years of college studying IT, and a loan from his father had got the ball rolling. But paid work he found to be way harder to come by than he'd anticipated. That was until a small company by the name of Valiant called. They had fallen out with their previous web designer after their recruitment website went into meltdown for 2 days, helped in no small part by the designer's love of fine whiskey. And this misfortune, and a recommendation from a friend of a friend, had led them to call Cody earlier that day. Valiant were in a desperate situation, though, and had requested he come over immediately to discuss their needs, so he could get to work without delay, they said. And Cody, elated with this unexpected opportunity, duly obliged. An hour and a half of driving took him to a meeting in Burlington, Vermont, that began at 4 p.m. and went on way into the night. It was past 9 when he and the 3 concerned parties from Valiant all shook hands, and Cody was sent on his way as their latest, if somewhat youthful, hopeful IT wizard, employed to master the mysteries of the internet for them. Cody left their building feeling for the first time in his life like he was a man who had real responsibilities, and people actually depending on him. He walked tall as he strode to his car, and straight away he called his girlfriend Gemma to tell her the good news. She was, predictably, all screams and whoops and jumping about, which only served to make him feel even better. Even the slightly dismissive assistant at the drive-thru he stopped at didn't dent his inner joy, and he just took the food and smiled at her miserable face as he drove off. Then he was back on the road, still talking to Gemma, knocking off the miles that separated them. A journey less tedious for him than it had been earlier that day, as his good mood and Gemma's company on the phone dispelled the boredom. Soon he had taken the night ferry back across Lake Champlain, and then onto the highway that took him towards Saranac Lake, the town he considered himself lucky enough to call home. At first the road was dotted with other drivers, but the further he drove, the quieter it became, until he was mostly alone, on a road that appeared to be far quieter than usual. There were, strangely, hardly any house lights, and his car seemed to him like a little isolated, moving pool of light in a sea of darkness that night. Time passed quickly for him, though, as he talked about the future with Gemma. For the first time he could see his life moving forward, and he could dare to make actual plans with her. So when he came to the small town of Redford, that nestles along the Saranac Road, he was a little shocked at how quickly he felt he'd arrived there, and he glanced at the clock. 10:26, it said, as he sped through that small town. and out the other side following the Saranac River, which snakes along the side of that road. A few minutes later he crossed a small bridge that traverses the same waterway, and it was then he noticed some flashing lights up ahead, and he quickly realized that a car was pulled up at the side of the road. As he approached, he could see that the hood was up, and a man appeared to be stood just in front of it, flashlight in hand, looking at his engine. Cody related what he could see to Gemma, information which prompted her to tell him to drive on. But Cody was already slowing to a stop, still buoyed up as he was by his good fortune. He felt that he needed to share it with someone else, and this unfortunate traveller was a suitable recipient. He lowered his window and leaned out a little. "Hey, buddy, got a problem?" he said, dropping the tone of his voice a little to imply confidence. The seemingly unremarkable man, still studying his engine, lifted up his flashlight and half pointed it at Cody. "Hey, friend, I sure have," he replied as he stepped closer. The man was slim, mid-50s, with thin black wavy hair and eyebrows to suit. His smile seemed strangely disarming, and his manner was that of someone who already appeared to regard Cody as a friend, a seeming disposition that eased Cody to ask if there was anything he could do to help. "Well, yeah, I hope so," the man answered slowly. And he went on to explain that he was journeying to see an old friend who lived some way down the road, but after his car had unexpectedly broken down, he had pulled up and tried to call him for help, but there was no answer, something he half expected, as his friend's phone had seemed faulty when he called him earlier. His friend, he explained, repaired cars as a hobby, and if he could just get there, he was sure he would find him at home, and then be able to retrieve his car. Cody wasn't quite convinced by this story. It seemed too convenient, and he was slightly regretting his hasty stop. But it was then he noticed that the man appeared to be dressed in the neck garb of a priest, an item which instantly put him at ease. Gemma had also listened intently to this exchange, and she tried to get Cody's attention, but before she could say much, he had agreed to take the man to his friend's house, a journey he was assured was not too far out of his way. Cody quickly explained to Gemma that his soon-to-be passenger was seemingly a man of the church, a fact which didn't reassure her much, as she told him in return that it might just be an outfit. But by then it was too late, as the priest was opening the door and getting into the passenger seat, as she finished her warning. "Thomas," the man said as he put out his hand to Cody. Cody took it and smiled as he delivered his own name in return, quickly following it with an explanation that Gemma was there too, albeit on the phone. She duly greeted his new companion. The priest replied to her greeting with the words, "You think I might be some sort of axe murderer, then?" A question that made Gemma laugh. But she did a very poor job of hiding the fact that she still thought he might be. Driven on by her nagging concern, she then asked the priest where he was travelling from, and when he answered Massachusetts, she then began to quiz him on what he'd been doing there and why. He gave short and plausible answers, but nothing that she could verify, until eventually Cody became a little embarrassed by this impromptu inquisition, and told Gemma that she might as well give it up, because if his passenger really is an axe murderer, then questions aren't going to make much difference. They all laughed at this, but Cody stopped laughing when he saw the priest reach down and pick up the brown briefcase that he had brought with him. Pulling it quickly open, he reached inside and began to take something out. Cody instinctively leaned away ever so slightly, as his guest announced, "I am no axe murderer. My weapon of choice is—" And a momentary pause then followed, during which both Cody and Gemma felt a cold wave of fear welling in their stomachs. "My sermons," the priest then said loudly. Another pause followed, which was meant to be filled with more laughter, but the hesitant delay served to reveal that the recipients of this joke weren't wholly amused by it. Cody eventually laughed, and that elicited the priest's next line, which was to say that he was renowned for his tedious sermons, and if they liked he could have a go at boring them to death. Worried his guest might really be serious about giving a sermon, Cody struggled to find the words to politely refuse, but ended up simply blurting out, "No thanks," while giving the priest a sideways glance that conveyed that he worried a little about the sanity of his passenger. "I'll give you one anyway," the priest said, "a very short one. Show kindness to a weary traveller, and your reward shall be in the kingdom of heaven." Cody half laughed again. "That is a short sermon," he said. "Yes," the priest replied. "Leviticus 3:27. It's my favorite quote." Gemma interrupted the exchange to tell them that she would be quiet for a few minutes, as she had to go and do something, and his guest then proceeded to tell Cody all about his various travels around the country, and how he had met so many kind and generous people just like him. The conversation was entertaining enough that Cody slipped into a more relaxed state, listening to the droning voice of his passenger, such that when he suddenly half shouted, "Turn here, next left," it jolted Cody a little. Soon they were off the highway and onto a back road, the thick woods either side seeming to close in around their car as the priest continued the account of his life story. He soon broke off again to instruct Cody to turn right onto what was little more than a gravel track. "Not far now," he informed him, as if to reassure Cody that this rudimentary road actually led somewhere. While passable, though, it was rapidly becoming a dirt track, and Cody's doubts about driving down it started to increase when a mist began to drift out of the trees from the right-hand side, a mist that seemed to thicken the further they went until it enveloped them as they bounced along what was now a track pockmarked with water-filled holes. Unable to see more than 10 feet ahead, Cody had to brake suddenly when a T-junction appeared out of the mist, and he turned to ask his passenger which way to take. But the priest seemed distracted. Without warning, a searing migraine-like headache gripped Cody. His passenger gave him a concerned look as Cody rubbed his forehead with his palm and told of his sudden affliction with just the word headache, which prompted the priest to then in turn state that Cody was probably overtired and that the light reflecting off the mist might be giving him eye strain. Cody gave a feeble response of "yeah, probably," baring his teeth with the pain. "I don't suppose you have any painkillers in that bag of yours?" he asked. "No," the priest replied, "but what I do have is better than that. One other thing I'm renowned for is laying on hands." "I'll heal you," he said in a soothing tone. Cody found the suggestion a little peculiar in the circumstances. He would far rather have taken a pill, but the stabbing pain in his head made him agreeable to this unorthodox treatment. And soon the priest's hands were hovering above him. A few awkward moments passed, in which nothing seemed to happen, and Cody considered filling the silence with a joke. But then, to his utter surprise, his pain simply vanished, almost as if someone had turned it off. "That's amazing," Cody said, turning to the priest, who was now smiling knowingly. "I am blessed with the touch," he said to Cody, before motioning to the right to show him the way on. At this point Gemma announced her return with a single and slightly surly "hey," and then Cody's phone indicated the arrival of a text. He picked it up, and seeing the message was from Gemma, he opened it to read, "There is no Leviticus 3:27. He resorted to a direct response to this, telling Gemma that all was okay, and that she had no need to worry, the healing hands of his passenger having dispelled most of the lingering doubts he had about his authenticity. They drove on through the wall of grey haze that encased them, and the priest pointed this way and that as they came to junction after junction, to the point that Cody was becoming a little concerned about finding his way back. The priest eventually announced they had reached their destination, as a large post on the left-hand side of the road loomed up out of the fog, unremarkable except for a white H that had been painted onto it. "Tom Hagel," the priest said. "He's not a man to spend bucks on a fancy sign. His house is just over there," he said, looking into the darkness. Cody strained to see anything at all, but he could just make out some shapes that he assumed must be it. "Are you sure your friend's home?" he asked quizzically, wondering why no lights were visible. "Oh yeah, he'll be sat in his back room watching his TV in the darkness, just like he always does," the priest replied as he exited the car. "I made you this," he then said, putting out his hand, which contained a small scrap of paper. "I scribbled down a map for you, so you don't get lost on your way home," he said, smiling. Cody took it gratefully, as the priest thanked him for his kindness, before turning and in a few steps disappearing into the night. He breathed a sigh of relief while reversing, before heading back the way he had come. His good deed was done, but, as is often the case, the doing of that deed had proved slightly more trying than he had imagined. He was now tired to the point of exhaustion, and he just wanted to be back home. Gemma was the first to speak as he drove off. She shouted into her phone, "I'm glad he's gone. What were you thinking? Don't ever do that again." Cody laughed at her outburst and told her that she had missed how his passenger had healed him, how that was hardly the actions of a lunatic. But Gemma was unrepentant, saying that it didn't matter what he had done, as it could be coincidence anyway, and that it really hadn't all been worth the risk. But as she was saying that, Cody's attention drifted to the scrap of paper that contained the priest's scribbled map. He had come to a crossroads, and the map instructed him to turn right. But the strange thing was that he didn't really remember this turning. He followed the priest's sketch, and soon was rolling up to another junction. This time a right and a left lay before him, and the map said right, but again he had no recollection of this, and he then realized he actually had no memory of any turn he'd taken at all. All he could remember was the priest directing him, but not what he had actually done in response. So without the map, he would in fact be utterly lost. As he turned right, he joked to Gemma that she should thank the priest, because without that map, she might not be seeing him for a few days. But no reply came. Just a few broken words, and hisses that indicated to Cody that his phone had lost its signal. Struck for the first time by how utterly isolated he now was, his confidence that he was still in control evaporated when a large white H appeared out of the mist. A H painted onto a black post that told Cody he was back where he started from. He stopped briefly, staring at the post, hoping he could see something about it that might suggest that this was an entirely new post he was looking at. But convinced it wasn't, he drove off, and in a short time was back at that crossroads. This time he stopped and put the light on to make sure he read the map correctly. To his surprise, he'd made a mistake. It wasn't right, it was left. He was meant to turn left, and his spirits lifted at seeing he'd just made a simple error. He turned, and at the next junction followed the map again, which indicated that left was the correct path. But soon, to his utter confusion, that familiar white letter and post came out of the mist once more. This time he didn't stop. His anger and frustration made him haste towards that now familiar crossroad. He didn't stop there either, but shot across it, driving a little too fast to be safe in the cloud of white that surrounded him. He told himself that the priest must have missed that crossroad out, that it must be the next crossroad, which he duly came to. But when he looked at his map, it instructed him to go straight. Cody knew then that there was something very wrong. His headaches, maybe. Maybe he was suffering from confusion. In whatever event, he knew he had to get home, or get that phone signal back. He drove on, hoping that this time he would get it right. But any hope of that dissipated when that now hateful sign appeared before him, and told him that he had indeed no chance of escaping this place unaided. It then occurred to him that he did in fact have one means of salvation. All he had to do was stop and go and find the priest, and if he actually were unwell, he could at least then get help. He parked his car side on, pointing his lights towards where he imagined the house must be. But his lights fell on a structure that wasn't a house at all, but an old barn, run down and decrepit. Cody couldn't understand it. He was sure it looked like the same place. But then he laughed at his assumed stupidity. Obviously, he thought, this was one building of many around here, and maybe each one had a post with a H painted on it nearby. All he had to do was retrace his steps and continue to follow the map and then he would be able to escape this wooded maze he felt he was in. But before he could move his hand to drive off, his headache suddenly returned with a vengeance. He sat for a while, rubbing his temples, trying to relax. If it didn't pass quickly, he thought, he would just have to try to ignore it as best he could. But he knew that driving in this state was not going to be easy. A noise outside then drew his attention, and strangely seemed to dispel his pain. He didn't look up immediately. He imagined it must be some animal moving in the darkness, but a slight tapping at his window quickly destroyed that delusional notion and turned him cold. That pane of glass was all that stood between him and a host of terrors that shot through his mind in that instant. His eyes lifted to the left towards that unwelcome sound, and what he saw gripped his heart for a second, for a pale human face, seemingly hovering in the mist, greeted him. But his terror quickly subsided when the apparent phantom moved closer to reveal it was Thomas, the priest. A strange mixture of fear and relief welled around inside him as he lowered his window to greet his former companion. "You scared me," he said, laughing, his voice trembling ever so slightly at the same time. The priest laughed in return. "Sorry about that," he said. "On a night like this, it's hard not to be scary." "Are you okay?" he asked. "You've driven past a few times, and we were worried. You must be struggling with my directions." Cody confirmed that he was totally lost, an admission that would have embarrassed him deeply had it been revealed in any other circumstances, as he prided himself on always knowing the route to and from a place. He realized in that instant that if he had in fact returned to this spot 3 times by different routes, then he might actually be going a little crazy, and that he would then need to phone for help. But where was the home the priest had claimed was there, he thought. He blurted out a somewhat desperate request to know where this Tom Hagel's house actually was, a question which made the priest smile as he pointed into the mist. "Just over there," he said. "On a normal night, you'd be able to put your lights on it, but not tonight." Cody was reassured by this easy explanation, and quickly asked if he could come inside for a while to get his bearings and maybe see a better map. It was a choice he wasn't exactly keen on, but the alternative of spending the rest of the night driving around in circles with a migraine until his gas ran out was far more unappealing than going into the darkness to find this alleged property. It did occur to Cody at that point that it was odd that the priest didn't have a flashlight, and even stranger that there were still no lights visible in the mist. But these were only minor discrepancies that he could easily dismiss, so he left the engine idling and his lights on, as he didn't much fancy a walk in total darkness with a man that was still a stranger, and he intended to come back to turn everything off once the supposed house had been found and his lingering doubts dispelled. They set off in that falsely comforting automotive light, as they followed what seemed to be an earthen track that led into the trees. "My friend's house is a little basic," the priest then suddenly announced, as if to excuse an impending embarrassment. "It's more of a log cabin than anything else," he said. Cody smiled and asked if his friend was a hunter, but before the priest could answer, He was once more struck with a searing pain in his head as his migraine returned, so bad this time that he cried out a little as he halted, leaning forward. The priest stopped and put his hand out towards Cody. "I could see that headache was back when you were in the car. Here, let me heal you again," he said, putting out his long white fingers towards him. And Cody struggled to look up, grimacing with the pain. "Is it far?" he asked. "To where?" the priest answered, quickly following that with, "Oh, the house. No. But let me heal you first." Cody reluctantly agreed, as it had seemingly worked before, but he would have preferred to have been indoors. "Close your eyes," the priest said, as he closed his own, reaching out and placing his hands over Cody's shoulders. He had little choice but to obey. The pain alone made him want to close his eyes, and he had to set aside any lingering lack of trust he had in the priest, as he felt those bony hands touch his scalp once more. Again, he instantly felt the pain begin to subside, and he relaxed and was about to thank his seeming blessed healer. But then Cody became aware of another sensation. It felt like he was rocking from side to side, and then as if he were falling. But as the sensation intensified, he began to feel as if he were being drawn from his body, almost as if something were trying to consume him. Unable to cope with the rising feeling of dread welling within him, he opened his eyes. From his slightly stooped position, he could see the partially illuminated lower half of the priest in front of him, and he lifted and turned his head to look up at his face. What he saw froze him, not just in fear, but in disbelief. A blue haze seemed to be rising from his own body, a haze that was being drawn upwards towards the open mouth of the priest, a mouth now filled not with the clean white enamel that had previously resided there, but with blackened and rotted teeth, a mouth filled with this blue light. Cody let out a cry, partly of terror, partly of aggression. He hit the priest in the midriff, pushing him away with both hands as he recoiled in the direction of his car. The creature tottered backwards, obviously off balance, its putrid, chalk-white and withered hands flailing around in front of it, as if trying to draw that energy towards itself, as its head flopped around and its mouth let out a deep, low, grating exhale of air that seemed to draw it back to physical awareness. Its eyes then suddenly opened, pupilless eyes that were a sickening grey-white, that seemed to pulse irregularly with that same blue hue that it appeared to have leached from him. Cody stumbled backwards away from the creature as it raised its arms, reaching out towards him, tendrils of blue light still leaving his body, snaking through the air to his monstrous assailant. He half screamed at it, trying to imply strength to conceal his utter terror, but this only seemed to encourage the creature. It crouched a little and advanced towards him, letting out a shrill hiss that seemed to cut the air and hurt his ears as it did so. It seemed smaller than the form of the priest. Its clothes now hung limply, and its hair was greyed and hanging in thin clusters around a face contorted in malice. He turned and ran towards the light. He was clearly faster on his feet than this being, but that did little to dispel his terror. He managed to get to his car soon enough that he could get in and reverse backwards, closing the door as he did so, before the creature then shambled towards him, and he could see the reflected glow on its hand as it reached towards his side window, its fingers flailing frantically at the glass, as his foot abandoned the concept of measured acceleration and hit the floor, trapping the pedal beneath it. He shot forward at such speed that he was unable to see anything but a wall of thick fog blanketing his windshield. He knew that he couldn't continue to drive like that, but he also knew that creature had turned to follow him. Its shape, illuminated in the red glow of his tail lights, told him as much as he drove off, but for a moment it was as if Cody had no control over his body. His hands and his feet seemed to be beyond his reason, as if they were four separate individuals working together to save their lives, and they weren't going to let Cody's brain override them. It took considerable effort to eventually force his foot to lift, but the 40 miles an hour he had reached meant he had to tame his willful limb. The car slowed a little as Cody's terror turned to desperation when he realized he'd just gone over the crossroad. His speed had negated any chance of choice, but Cody knew already that choices didn't seem to be relevant in this place. All he could do was hope that his path might end his nightmare. He determined then to slow a little more. He was sure that there must be a good gap now between him and whatever that was behind him. Gemma's voice then broke the nightmare fleetingly, a soothing comfort to him, like the sound of safety and sanity. He was sure she asked him if he was okay. He replied with the abandon of someone who knew that death stalked them, and he pleaded with her to call the police to get him help. But no response came, only the return of that crackling that said he was still beyond help. He knew in that instant that somehow that creature was affecting his phone, and most likely it was the source of the headaches and the confusion he had felt. But as these thoughts flashed through his mind, the car rose and fell, as if driving over something large, and Cody moved his eyes back to the road just in time to see a large tree trunk lying right across his path. He moved his foot to brake, but before he could, his car crashed to an instant stop, throwing him forward as the airbag hit him in the face. He fell back in his seat limply. His first thought was that he wasn't dead. His second, that he soon might be. He tried to drive, but the front wheel span impotently. His headlights were still working, so he imagined that he might have just run up onto the tree trunk, and maybe there was a way to push the car off. And with that somewhat desperate thought, he got out of his car to inspect the damage. His suspicion proved correct. His front wheels were both off the floor, and his still trembling, adrenaline-filled body instantly carried out his next thought, which was to pick up a nearby branch, and with it tried to lever his car free. He lifted the suitably sized bough, giving no care to the cold mud that now caked his hands, and he found a suitable place to wedge it in between the fender and the tree trunk, but it was clearly immovable. And Cody then knew he only had two options left: to run into the dark, mist-filled woods where he couldn't see his attacker coming, or to stay here and fight. At that very moment he heard a noise way back down the road, a shuffling sound that made his throat close and his skin turn cold. One other option then suddenly sprung into his mind. Maybe, he thought, he would be safe in the car. Maybe the windows would be tough enough to keep it out, and he could wait until morning, or until his phone signal returned. That seemed like the better option of the three, and he hurried back inside the security of his glass and metal ally, taking a suitably sized piece of wood with him to serve as a weapon. He didn't have long to wait for the arrival of his former acquaintance, as he saw the vague outline of the creature that he had once foolishly called a priest arriving in the red glow behind him. Cody turned to watch it, but all he could then make out were glimpses of something moving around the car, movement that reminded him of how a predator might stalk its prey. He stared at where he imagined it was, but his suspicion proved to be wrong when he saw what appeared to be a face at the passenger's side window. That same pallid, twisted face he now knew was the preacher's true form. Its sunken, dead eyes almost felt to Cody as if they penetrated the glass itself, as he heard its hand trying the door handle. He clutched his improvised club with a quivering hand, preparing himself for an expected assault. But the creature simply withdrew into the mist. He sat back a little, telling himself inside his head that his idea had worked, and a hopeful relief started to infuse his senses, a relief that disintegrated as his windshield shattered at the arrival of a large stone thrown from somewhere out in the darkness. Cody sat rigid in cold terror. That thin sheet of glass in which he had placed his hopes now hung crumpled inward under the weight of a stone that was large enough to convey to him that his enemy was not as feeble as it looked. He knew in that instant that another blow could knock that window out completely, and then he would have to fight while sat down, trapped in the car. He could think of only one option: to get out and fight. He opened his door, his crippling dread almost overcoming his will to stand, a dread that said run, a dread that said hide. But his mind had made its choice, and his body was still subject to that consciousness that ruled it, a consciousness that no longer lived in a world it understood, but rather it clung to ideals from a lost time that existed not an hour before. He fell from the car, and then clambered over the tree trunk, giving no care as broken branches scathed his flesh and tore his clothes as he pushed past them, desperate as he was to get into the light of his headlights. The mist around him now glowed white in that same light, which limited his field of battle. Cody knew he could not go beyond it, as he could not fight that creature in the dark, and he would live or die here in this luminous ring of combat. He stood, club in hand, his clothes torn and dirtied by his ordeal, and he waited for the assault that would decide his fate. But that which hunted him didn't come. Cody could hear it moving in the darkness, still circling him, as the mist seemed to grow more intense, so thick that as he put the club out before him, he could barely see the tip of it. A noise behind him then made him wheel around, swinging his club wildly as he did. but it met with nothing, and only the sound of his beating heart and the silent creeping emptiness of that forest then filled his ears. Another noise then came from over his right shoulder, and with it, what he was sure was a touch on the back of his head. He swung his club impotently once more, again it meeting nothing, but this time a thin ribbon of blue light seemed to fleetingly hang in the air before him. He peered into the mist, but the creature was seemingly already behind him again. He was sure this time. The cold nails of a bony hand scratching the back of his skull made him jump and turn as he and his club rotated in unison. But all he could see were the strands of that same blue substance hanging in the air. Strands he knew intuitively were his life force, and he knew then that his enemy had him exactly where it intended him to be. Desperation overtook his mind, the desperation of a wounded animal that knows it cannot escape that which hunts it. He flailed wildly with his club, each swing preceded by writhing fingers on his head. He stumbled and shouted obscenities at the creature, but each swing of the club seemed to be more difficult, as if that wooden hope for protection was in fact sapping his strength. But he knew it wasn't. He knew it was that abomination just beyond his vision that was taking his life piece by piece, strand by strand. Then one word suddenly filled his mind. Run. He knew he could outrun it. He knew then he should never have tried to fight it. All he had to do now was run and keep running. He stepped forward to start his escape, but his legs, on which all his hope now resided, merely collapsed beneath him, sending him crashing forward into the mud. Cody could feel those hands writhing through his hair as he lay there. He knew he had to get up, and he forced himself to his knees, but that blue haze was now swirling around him, and being drawn away into the mist to where he knew that creature must lie. He tried to get to his feet, to follow those strands and kill what lay at the end of them, but he had no strength left to execute his will. He heard Gemma's voice at that moment as his phone was released from whatever force had disabled it. It could have been salvation, but Cody knew it wasn't. He knew it was just sharing its cruelty. He began to cry at his hopeless state, and at the thought he would never see his friends or family again. But then those hands returned to his scalp, and his family faded from his mind until he could not remember them. Each touch from those unseen clawing fingers seemed to strip away a little more of what he was, until all he could remember was Gemma. He could hear her voice calling him. He shouted to her, but instead a feeble whimper came from his mouth, a whimper that caused her to shout into her phone for him to tell her what was happening. But no answer came, just the word no, repeated with increasing desolation as Cody moved his club limply in front of him, trying to hit the thing he knew was intent on destroying him, but his body lacked any means to do that now. A low hiss then began to fill his ears, a rasping hiss that conveyed the pleasure that his attacker was deriving from its success, a callous, jarring sound of evil that rose in intensity with his own desperate voice. His cries then rang through the empty woods and through the phone to Gemma's ears, cries that became the muffled screams of a dying man as Cody slumped to the cold earth, his life force gone. Gemma spent that night gripped in horror at what she had heard, a horror that was confirmed when the police, who had been spurred to action by her desperate calls to them, then visited her the following day to tell her that Cody's body had been found. The coroner recorded a verdict of heart failure as the cause of death. Cody had no visible signs of assault, and it was assumed that overwork and the accident had pushed his body over the edge. Gemma protested at this verdict. She told the police about the priest, a man they could find no evidence of, and they could find no house near where he was found. Nothing that said to them that Gemma's words were any more than the delusional ramblings of a bereft woman who had lost her love. So they dismissed her account and her story about hearing his death cries and the sound of his attacker. But Gemma still knew what she heard. She knew the cold terror in Cody's voice that night, and she knew that unspeakable evil she heard was the real cause of his demise. In the years after, she sought answers and tried to find an explanation. What she discovered were similar stories across the country and across the world. Stories spread over centuries of people who had died in isolated places for inexplicable reasons, of creatures that appeared as figures of trust, be they children, old women, or religious figures, but they always lured their intended victim to some isolated place, only to transform and reveal their malefic intention and true being. Gemma eventually knew that only she understood what happened to Cody that night, and she also knew that whatever killed Cody was still out there, stalking lonely places where some solitary traveller can be found. It, and hundreds like it, lurking in the darkness, hunting their next victim.